Góðan daginn. Hi, welcome back to Icelandic for Foreigners. This video will be my last in a series of videos I've made about strong verbs. In this video, we're going to be talking about the imperative form, which is the command form. So let's start with the við and þið imperative forms because they're the simplest. Now, these forms are always predictable. They are always the same as the present tense form, except for one verb, að vera, to be. There's never any vowel shift except for the umlaut when you have an A in the stem sometimes, and we'll look at an example of that. So let's look at an example, að bjóða, to invite. Now remember that the við and þið imperative forms are always the same as the present tense. So we just look at the present tense forms for við and þið, and there's our imperative right here. And because we're on the right side of the chart here, there's never going to be any vowel shift except for the umlaut. So an example sentence with one of these forms would be bjóðum þeim í veisluna, which means let's invite them to the party. Now let's look at a quick example with an umlaut, like að taka, to take. Just notice here that we have the a shifting to an in the present tense, which means it also shifts to an in our imperative form. Now let's look at að vera because it's the only real exception to this rule for the við and þið form. We have a við form of verum and a þið form of verið. Vera is the only verb that has an irregular við and þið form in the present tense, and that's why it's different for the imperative. All right, let's move on to the Thu form of the imperative, which is always a little bit trickier. Now here are the rules. There's never any vowel shift. We first remove the word final a, and then we add either eðu, dieu, or tieu, depending on the final consonant in the verb, the infinitive of the verb. And we also need to note that the final consonant may also change. So let's talk about the final consonant, what that means. So to identify the final consonant, it's usually the consonant that comes right before the a at the end of a verb. For example, að bera, the final consonant is er. This counts even when we have multiple consonants just before the a, like gjalda, the final consonant is die. Now, with some verbs, we have a final consonant and then a j. The final consonant, for the sake of the imperative form, is the consonant before the j. So in the verb að segja, the final consonant is gie, not yoth. And then some verbs, like sjá, don't have a final consonant, so we just say that this ends in a vowel. These are verbs that only have one syllable in the infinitive form, and it usually is a vowel other than an a, like you can see here. All right, so once you know the final consonant, then you can guess which ending to add for the Thu form in the imperative. So you'll add the ending eðu when the final consonant is an f, g, r, or a vowel. So let's look at some examples. Gefa becomes gevðu. So notice we drop the a, and then we add eðu at the end. Draga becomes dragðu. Segja becomes segðu. And notice here that the final consonant is actually a g, not the yoth. And that's just because the yoth can never be the final consonant. And then bera becomes berðu, and sjá, which is an example of a vowel final infinitive, becomes sjáðu. Now the one exception to this rule is að vera, to be, which becomes vertu. It doesn't take an eðu like you would think, it takes a tieu. Now let's look at the ending dieu. You will add this ending when the final consonant is an ed, etl, m, or n. For example, bíða becomes bitu. And notice here also that if it is an ed, the ed will also change into a die, so you have two dies. So bíða becomes bitu, fela becomes feltu, selja becomes seltu, and notice there that the final consonant is an etl, not a yoth. Lemja becomes lemtu, and skína becomes skintu. Now the final ending is tieu, which we add when the final consonant is a die, a kau, pie, S or tie. So gjalta becomes gjaltu. And notice that the die just disappears because we can't have a die right next to a tie. Vekja becomes vektu. Sleppa becomes sleftu. Lesa becomes lestu. Velta becomes veltu. And notice here that we just have a T that doesn't change. So really only the last letter changes. And setja becomes setu. And notice here that we have two T's instead of just one. And that's because the T in setja isn't in a consonant cluster. So we need a consonant cluster there, so we have to add an extra T. Now, one exception to this category is the verb adsenta, to send, which just becomes sentu in the imperative form. I just want to say that the best approach for remembering which consonants take which endings is just to learn specific examples. So rather than learning that tie u comes after die, kau, pie, s, and tie, just remember some of these examples, that lesa becomes lestu, and bida becomes bitu. That'll make your job a lot easier if you just remember specific examples, and then you'll get a feel for it, and you'll just think, even when you encounter a new verb, you'll think, okay, I know which ending this should have because of its final consonant, or just the way that it sounds. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to leave comments or questions below, and stay posted. Bless, bless.